We're talking week 9, man. The season's going by fast, bro. But there's been such a lot of change this year. And one of the more notable changes was the quarterback change, obviously, with Deshaun Watson going down. Jameis Winston earned the start for the Cleveland Browns. Tyler, it changed the whole offense, bro. Like, this thing went from barely startable, questionable flexes at best to like, now we got plenty of options with this Browns team, man. Jameis Winston came in through for over 300 yards against the Baltimore Ravens. And talk about this, man, because we had talked about like, players and values, but it's like we're getting some starting caliber potential here out of this Cleveland unit.
Yeah, it's really exciting for an offense, really for a fan base that's been. Oh man, I feel bad for Browns fans. Bad decision after bad decision, but it's obviously for fantasy football. It's exciting because with Jameis, do I think that Jameis is a really good starting quarterback in the NFL? Not really. Like he's okay, but the one thing that he does, like he's a gunslinger. He's not afraid to throw interceptions. He's going to throw interceptions, but he's also going to make some big plays. I believe I heard a stat for his career. He's averaging over 277 yards per game
Sheesh.
passing, which is great for fantasy football purposes. This opens up a lot of different things for this offense. Another crazy stat was Deshaun Watson hasn't thrown for 200 passing yards in one game this season, which is insane. I didn't even believe it when I heard it. I went and looked it up and it's true. So this just opens up everything for this offense. And another thing is the Mari Cooper trade. So we have a guy who right now, oh my gosh, I can't even remember his name. What's his name? Uh,
Tillman.
Tillman. I was thinking Jamari Trask, but that's who they drafted this year. Cedric Tillman. A lot of people kind of liked Tillman last year as a prospect, but the problem was obviously right now we see Deshaun Watson was awful. Also, they had Mari Cooper and they traded for Elijah Moore. But another guy, Elijah Moore, who I think is going to obviously Tillman right now is going to be the biggest ad this week in
Yeah.
fantasy football. He should have been like a lot of people had him last week, but he's going to be one of the biggest ads. But I think a guy kind of flying under the radar right now is Elijah Moore, and I think a lot of people have written off Elijah Moore, and maybe he's not very good, maybe as good as people thought he was going to be, but he's also played with Zach Wilson, who we know is awful, and now Deshaun Watson, who we think is awful. And he just led this team with 12 targets. He's not going to be a down the field kind of guy. He's closer, a little bit closer to the line of scrimmage. I think of kind of like Josh Downs, maybe not as good as Josh Downs, but that's kind of what we're looking for in an offense that really with Jameis Winston, like he has nothing to lose. Like this is just his moment to go out there and just put up as many yards and stats as he can. And I think it's interesting with this offense, and Nick Chubb even gets a boost as well. So I'm
Well,
excited going
it's
forward.
there's so much to unpack here because it's the change happened very quickly, right? We see Deshaun go out. We're like, is it DTR starting or is it Jameis? And they're going up against a Baltimore Ravens unit, which on paper, for a lot of people, are like, oh, the Baltimore Ravens defense, it's super tough. They're one of the league leaders
Secondary,
in yardage
yeah.
allowed to quarterbacks. So it's like we're getting a little bit of a mixed bag here because is
Mm-hmm.
this now a fantasy powerhouse? That's the main question. And I think a lot of people are going to be asking themselves, can I tie myself to this Browns offense for the first half of the year? It looked anemic. And now
Yeah.
with Jameis, we're getting 300 yards, 40 passing attempts, over 25 completions. So everything seems inflated, but we also know who Jameis is. Jameis has had a history of being an inconsistent up and down option. He's looked good in limited starts with the Saints. He got hurt. He looked, there was times in Tampa where he looked elite, others where he looked like he was barely startable. So I think this is a refined Jameis Winston who is, I would call him a trustable asset against good matchups, right? Like if he
Mm-hmm.
has a good matchup defensively for this team, I think he's worth the start. Other than that, I think you might want to stay away from the Jameis Winston because of the limited weapons. When we talk about the weapons, right? That's also a big boom for David Njoku, who I think
Yeah.
is probably the biggest beneficiary out of this all because of the volume, right? Looked his way in the end zone, and obviously the targets weren't. He wasn't the league leader in the
Yeah.
targets, but he's going to be an elite top 5 to top 3 tight end the rest of the way. Like just because he's the best receiver on this team. So I know that there's probably going to be a lot of people asking, like, who do I pick up? Cedric Tillman? Is it Elijah Moore, Jerry Judy? And I think you kind of alluded to it already, Tyler. I think there's kind of opportunity here for all three
Yeah.
receivers. And I know you mentioned Elijah Moore as your favorite. Cedric Tillman is mine. And obviously the big body receiver, they had talked him up during the offseason. This is a chance now for us to find probably flex to wide receiver 3 value in multiple receivers in this offense.
Yeah, and Cedric Tillman's my favorite. I don't,
Okay.
but Elijah Moore is kind of like that situation early in the year when a lot of people were rushing out to pick up like Demarcus Robinson, like when both the wide receivers for the Rams went down, and then Tutu Atwell kind of was going. He was a guy that you didn't even really have to spend a whole lot of fab on, and
Yeah.
you could just let clear waivers, and then you could pick him up. That's kind of how I look at Elijah Moore. I don't think a whole lot of people are going to be rushing out to add Elijah Moore. I think everybody will be fighting for over Cedric Tillman, where I think Elijah Moore could probably go unclaimed in your league, or maybe not even spend a whole lot of fab on him, where you could get him and he could. I don't want to say he's the wide receiver one here, but he could be up there in the mix where it's a 1A, 1B type of situation where he can see, especially in full point PPR formats, he can see a lot of catches and earn targets. So he's interesting in that regard, where somebody that
I got concerns about Elijah Moore though. I have just just ceiling concerns, right? Like when you look
yeah,
at a
that's
Cedric
fine.
Tillman, obviously I think he's like the bona fide alpha receiver in this offense. But it's like Jerry Jeudy is still there too and had
I
a
think he's
decent game.
ass.
And yeah, a lot of
Jerry's
people say the
ass.
same thing about Jerry Jeudy, right? Like, but he does have pedigree and he did have a very similar performance to what Elijah Moore had. I think he carries
All of them get
slightly
an
more
upgrade.
upside as well.
Yeah. No,
So
and if one of them clears, like I'd be picking up that guy. It's kind of how I'd approach this situation right now. Just add him to the end of my bench. See how it
and you
plays
know
out.
what? It's going to be hard because we're also going to see the bad Jameis games, and then we're going to be like,
Yes.
why do we pick up any of these guys, right?
Yeah. No, agreed.
Well, it's tough, man. In this Browns offense, I think one of the things you have to ask yourself is it legit? And they do have a tough schedule, Tyler. They got the Los Angeles Chargers coming up here in week 9, a bye in week 10. And then week 11, 12, 13, we got New Orleans, Pittsburgh, Denver, and then Pittsburgh again in KC. So some tough matchups here.
Mhm.
Is this something where if you saw Cedric Tillman, you're like, maybe you're 3-5 or you have a losing record, are you like all in Cedric Tillman, spend what you got? Because I've seen that thrown out there and that seems a little bit extreme.
Um, that's interesting. I don't want to say yes because I hate me personally. I just don't like to spend a whole lot of fab on wide receivers because we see this kind of stuff. The one thing I will say in the limited sample size we've seen with like Jameis under center that said and no more Amari Cooper that Cedric Tillman has looked really good and he was an interesting prospect as well. So I don't know if I'd spend all my fab because you know that there's going to be a running back here. There always is a running
Yeah.
back at the end of the year that ends up getting picked up and is a league winner down the stretch. I don't mind it though if you're in a spot where you really need wide receiver help because there are some wide receivers that are banged up. I mean, you had Diggs go down, so there's guys who are banged up, and if you really need wide receiver help, I think that he could be a guy who has a lot of potential down the stretch. So I don't mind it if you need a wide receiver.
And this is Cleveland too. So the weather gets crazy and they have 2
Yeah.
home games in the fantasy playoffs. So just keep that in mind. I think Jameis can throw through it, but it's just one of the things to monitor, man, because as we go through this season, things change so much. We're losing receivers.
Mhm.
And if you go all in with Cedric Tillman, you might have done the same thing with Juju Smith-Schuster. You might have done the same
Yeah.
thing with Jawan Jennings. You might have done it with Demarcus Robinson earlier in the year. We've had countless names throughout the year that have
Mhm.
had elevated spots and then they turn out not to be anything. I'm not saying that's going to happen with Cedric Tillman. I think he's going to ball
Yeah.
out. But just know you dedicate all
There's
of your
risk.
fab to any one player, it doesn't always go your way.